right, demand for money. What is demand for money? Our need to have money. Remember what money is? Cash, currency. What do we consider money? Anything that's generally accepted in exchange for goods and services, okay? In the modern world, it means currency, cash, coins, bills, all right? And in former times, before there was any money, they used what they call commodity money, items that represented value in and of themselves, that they could be useful. A couple of pigs, yeah, you could buy a piece of land with it, or you could eat them, right? So, 3 demands: transaction demand, right? Got to buy something, need cash. That's becoming less and less important, I think, today. And precautionary demand. Sometimes you don't even see that in some economics textbooks. They don't even mention that. But we like to have a little bit extra just in case. And probably most importantly, we like to have some of our store of wealth, one of our assets in the form of cash because of liquidity, right? Money is the most liquid of assets, the easiest and cheapest to turn into other goods and services. When do we want to have, we don't mind having a lot of cash when interest rates are low, okay? When interest rates are low, the opportunity cost of holding on to cash is small. But when interest rates are high, okay, then we want to have less cash because the opportunity cost of holding cash are high. We have to give up the opportunity to make interest, to buy a CD or some other investment, right? So as interest rates rise, people generally speaking reduce their demand to hold cash. And I don't think, as I mentioned, I don't think the book mentions this, but as nominal GDP rises, we need more cash to buy that greater value of goods and services, okay? All right, how does the Fed influence interest rates? Now remember, if we are in a recessionary gap, okay, if you like that, or we could put it in the Keynesian thing, all right? If we're back here, well, then we want to go there. If we're back here, then we want to have AD shift out, okay? So we want to engage in expansionary monetary policy. Remember, I told you that, well, the book tells you, I didn't tell you. I repeat it, the mechanism, okay, is that a change in the money supply, right? M1 leads to a change in interest rates, which leads to a change in gross private domestic investment, which leads to a change in GDP and employment, okay? That's the mechanism, that the primary influence is on business investment, all right? So if we are in a contractionary gap, recessionary gap, okay, we want to expand the economy, we want to engage in expansionary monetary policy. What that means is increasing the amount of money, increasing the supply of money. What happens? Money flows into the economy. Some people find they have too much cash relative to other investments or purchases that they could make, right? So they find they have a lot of cash and they decide, I'm going to go out and buy that new Cadillac. Okay, all right. And what happens to AD? It increases, right? It begins to shift out. Okay? So we're back here. The Federal Reserve pumps money into the economy. Consumers find that they have more cash. They increase their spending. Okay? And what else happens? They will put money into the bank, right? The supply of money in the bank increases, and what happens to interest rates? They fall, okay? And when interest rates fall, now consumer borrowing and spending rises, and more importantly, business investment rises, and AD now shifts out, okay? What will happen, by the way, I'm not sure, does it talk about this? Do we talk about the open economy effect of monetary policy in here? Yeah, the net export effect. You do need to know that, all right? What happens? When interest rates fall, right? If interest rates drop in the United States to 3%, while at the same time they are at 7% in Mexico, we want to invest in Mexico. But to do so, we have to buy pesos. So demand for pesos increases and the price of the peso rises, right? We go from, what? Am I getting this right? Interest rates fall in the United States. People begin to sell off dollars, okay, to invest in Mexico. Price of the dollar falls, right? And what happens to, we go from $1 equals 2 foreign currency, to $1 now equals 1 foreign currency, right? The Mexican peso increases, appreciates in value because we're buying pesos, right? So it takes fewer pesos to buy a dollar, all right? The value of the dollar falls, it buys fewer pesos. So what happens to exports? Exports increase. Remember what happened in fiscal policy? Okay, when the government, trying to stimulate the economy, goes out and borrows money in order to spend more. Interest rates rise. People buy dollars to invest in the United States. The value of the dollar goes up. Exports become more expensive and fall, okay? So while the government is trying to expand the economy by spending more money, by borrowing money, they cause interest rates to go up and exports to fall. That doesn't happen here, right? In fact, we haven't gotten any of the offsets. We don't get any of the offsets, any of the crowding out effect that you get with fiscal policy. Remember that in fiscal policy, I should have left that up there, it was perfect, okay? Government spending, they try to increase, which causes interest rates to go up because they have to borrow it, so they're trying to push it out to here, okay? But interest rates rise, so, business investment falls. Consumer borrowing and spending falls. And as interest rates rise, people want to invest in the United States, so they buy dollars, which pushes up the price of the dollar, which gets our goods more expensive, so that exports fall, okay? But that doesn't happen in monetary policy. In monetary policy, Federal Reserve goes out and increases the money supply, okay? Consumers have more cash, they spend more money, money flows into the banks, interest rates fall, okay? And as interest rates fall, people sell off their dollar investments and buy investments in other countries at higher rates, so the value of the dollar comes down, exports rise. Everything is positive, much more effective. Remember I said the other major problem with fiscal policy is that we have these time lags, in particular the action time lag, where it takes 535 people to decide what they're going to do. We don't get that in monetary policy. The Federal Open Market Committee meets every 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes more often in times of crisis, and they decide what to do and go do it right away, okay? Federal Reserve decides they need to increase the money supply. The next day, open market operations begin at the New York Central Bank, okay? Federal Bank, Federal Reserve Bank, all right? Don't have that time lag. 6 weeks, maybe. 8 weeks, all right? Okay, how do they actually increase or decrease, right? This works in the opposite direction too, right? That if we're out here, the danger is we're going to end up here, right? We started here, AD shifted out, okay? Supply curve is going to shift back in, all right? So we want to engage in a contractionary policy to keep inflation. So what does the Fed do? Remove money from circulation, right? The supply of money in banks now decreases and interest rates rise. And we get the opposite effect. Business investment slows down, okay? Consumer borrowing and spending slows down. The value of the dollar rises, so exports slow down, okay? Keep AD from shifting out more. So how do they accomplish this? Through open market operations, right? Remember the structure of the Federal Reserve Bank? It has a board of governors, right? The people that are in charge, 7 people. They can be elected for 14 years. Once they can't be fired, and once their 14 years are up, they're done. They can't come back. The Federal Open Market Committee consists of the 7 guys on the board of directors, plus 4 rotating banks presidents. Okay? Remember, the Federal Reserve has 12 districts, and the New York president is always on it. So we got 12 people making, rather than, okay, Lee, good luck. Okay, break a leg. Are you familiar with that saying? Break a leg? Why do we say that? Do you know where that comes from? Break a leg? Kind of, yes. It comes from the fact that President Lincoln was assassinated at a theater by a guy named John Wilkes Booth. And as he was escaping, he broke his leg. He jumped from the balcony onto the stage, caught his leg, and broke it. And that's why I say, break a leg. We have all kinds of silly sayings. Sometimes you go, where did that come from? Right? What does that mean? We know what it means, but why do we say that? I don't know. But that means good luck. Break a leg. She has an internship interview here at Bunker Hill. By the way, all of you, if you're going to work out there, right? Did I talk about this? You should try to get an internship before you graduate from Bunker Hill, or at least from the university, right? If you're going on, really looks good on your resume. Employers like to see that you have some idea what it's like to go out and work, right? That you haven't been, like my brother, a student for 40 years. He was a student for 40 years. You know why? Because as long as he stayed in school, he didn't have to pay back his student loans. And he kept doing these things, and he didn't like them. He became a massage therapist, and he decided he didn't like that. And he went back to school. He was going to be a professional photographer, and he didn't like that. And then he went to chiropractic school and decided to be a chiropractor. He didn't like that. Yeah. And now he's a teacher. He likes that. He's going to stay there. Yeah. He likes being in school. Right? It's a continuation of the same theme. Well. Okay. How do we influence interest rates? By the bond market, right? Remember what a bond is a debt instrument. When the federal government wants to engage in deficit spending, meaning spending more money than they're taking in taxes, like we said, they have to go out and borrow it. And the way they borrow it is by issuing a bond, okay? And a bond is a debt instrument that basically says, you lend me some money. For every year that I have your money, I will pay you interest on that money. And then at the end of a specified period, I'll pay back the loan, right? It's the same as anything else. You borrow money from the bank, you have to pay it back with interest, same thing, okay? So every bond has a face value, okay? That's called the par value. It has an interest rate, and it has what they call a maturity date. How long will it be good for? 8 years, okay? So at the end, every year, they will pay you $700 if you lend them $10,000, right? So every year you earn $700, and then at the end of 8 years, they give you your $10,000 back, okay? Like I said, the Federal Reserve Bank is a big buyer of U.S. Treasury bonds. Banks buy them, and individuals buy them. Companies buy them, too, right? All right? So when the Federal Reserve wants to pump money into the economy, they go out and they buy these bonds back. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, I don't know this for certain, but I'm fairly certain about it, there weren't enough bonds out in circulation. The government hadn't borrowed enough money that there were millions or billions of dollars worth of bonds out there. So if the Federal Reserve went out and bought all the bonds, there wouldn't be much money flowing into the economy. But since then, the federal government has borrowed trillions of dollars, right? And there's all kinds of bonds out there, billions upon hundreds of billions of dollars worth of bonds. So now that's a useful tool. In the old days, they had to rely on these other tools that we haven't really talked about yet. The reserve, well, we did, didn't we? We talked about the reserve requirement, Yes. Okay, the reserve requirement, and what's the other tool? Remember what it was? The discount rate, what they call the discount rate or the federal funds rate. And really that's, open market operations are really designed to influence the federal funds rate, which is the rate one bank lends its excess reserves to another bank. Let's say that we have two banks here, okay? This isn't as true as it used to be, but we'll go with it anyway. It's good for illustration purposes. We got two banks, okay, A and B. And this bank has $1 million in deposits. Okay? And so does this bank. So how much can they lend out? Today, remember, the reserve requirement is 10%, more or less for most everybody. So they can lend out $900,000, but they have to reserve $100,000, and this is true for both. Okay, so at the end of the day, which technically, supposedly, they're supposed to be able to meet this, but that's not exactly true anymore either. But this is the way the bank's setup should be, right? They've taken in $1 million, they've lent out $900,000, they've held on to $100,000 as reserves, and at the end of the day, I show up at this bank A. It's 4:45. The bank closes at 5, and at 4:45 I show up and I say, listen, bank, I want to take my $100,000 out, okay? So I take my $100,000 out. Now the bank's reserves are down to 0. Okay? How much do they need $100,000? If I take $100,000 out? No. They only need, if I take $100,000 out, now they've only got $900,000, which means, right, they need to hold on to $810,000, right? Okay? I mean, they can lend out 810. Is that right? Yeah, and they need now reserves of 90, but they don't have them, all right? So I have my $100,000 and I go across the street and I put it in the bank. Now this bank has too much money. 1,100,000. They can lend out what? They need to keep 110,000, right? Is that right? Yeah, they need to keep 110,000, so they can lend out whatever that's supposed to be. 990, is that right? 990? Doesn't matter, that's not the important numbers. These are, okay? This bank has now, it's supposed to have how much? It's supposed to have 110,000, but how much does it have? It's got more than that, because I just put 100,000 in, all right? Right? So they had 100,000 and I put 100,000 in. Now they have $200,000 on reserve because nobody's going to show up in the last 15 minutes and borrow it. So they have required reserves of 110,000. These are required. And they have excess reserves of 90,000. All right so far? Okay. Now in the past this was more important to get rid of your excess reserves because they did not earn any interest at all. So the money just sat there. Today they do earn some interest, okay? But nevertheless, this bank has extra cash on hand. This bank needs cash. Okay? This bank would be very happy to lend the extra cash to this one rather than have it just sit there, okay? So this is the federal funds market. Now the rate at which, it's called the federal, they aren't federal funds, meaning they aren't owned by the federal government or the Federal Reserve. They're owned by the banks, but they're called the federal funds, and this is the federal funds market, the bank-to-bank excess reserves lending market. Not only that, but what happens if interest rates fall? And I know that I can borrow reserves from some other bank if I need them. Okay? The bank-to-bank borrowing rate goes down. I know that if I need money, I can borrow real cheap from somebody else. So what do I want to do? I want to lend out everything I can possibly lend out. I don't want to hold on to any reserves because I know at the end of the day I can borrow what I need real cheap, okay? So when interest rates fall, banks tend to reduce the amount of reserves that they hold on to because they know they can borrow real cheap from the excess reserves of other banks. So the amount of funds available to be lent out increases and interest rates fall. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? All right. So two things happen. Well, The Federal Reserve Bank itself is also a lender, okay? But typically you have to pay a slightly higher interest rate if you borrow from the Federal Reserve Bank itself. The reason being is that typically we don't want money, the Federal Reserve doesn't want banks just holding on, sitting on money. They want to put that money to work, okay? So they encourage banks to borrow from other banks. It may also be true, I'm not sure about this, it used to be, I think, true, but if you keep going to your parents and borrowing money and then paying back, they're going to start asking some questions, like, what are you doing, right? So if a bank continually comes to Daddy, the Federal Reserve, to borrow money, the Federal Reserve might say, I think we better come in and take a look at how you're running your business, because it seems to me you might be kind of risky, all right? And typically they won't go to the Federal Reserve to borrow money unless they can't borrow money from other banks. And why wouldn't other banks lend them money? Too risky, okay? That bank doesn't look like it's being well managed. They look like they're in trouble, so I'm not going to lend them any money. They have to go to the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. So that might be an indication also that the bank is not being well managed, and the Federal Reserve might want to, because they are responsible for supervising banks, that they may want to come in and audit them, okay? Take a look at them. But for the most part, the Fed wants to encourage banks to borrow from other banks, all right? So if they want to increase the money supply, the Federal Reserve Bank in New York City, right? The Federal Reserve Bank of New York goes out and engages in open market operations. And what do? They buy bonds. Give me your pieces of paper, take this money, right? And again, when the Fed increases its demand for bonds, I know what the book says, but I don't like it, I'm going on with this one. When it increases its demand for bonds, then the price of bonds will rise, okay? And at the same time as the Federal Reserve is buying bonds and pushing up the price of bonds, it's pumping money into the economy, into the banks, and what happens to interest rates? They come down, okay? Bond prices go up, interest rates go down, and vice versa, okay? That interest rates, as interest rates rise or fall, they affect bond prices, all right? Up or down. They move in opposite directions. Okay? We talked about why last time. If I have a $1,000 bond that pays 5% interest, I'm going to get a $50 annual payment. If a new bond is issued at 10% interest, I'm going to get a $100 payment every year. I wouldn't pay $1,000 for this bond if I can get this bond, right? I would only pay a price for this bond that equates this payment to a 10% rate. So in other words, I would only pay $500 for this bond. If I bought two $500 bonds, I'd get a $100 payment. If I bought $1,000 bond, I get a $100 payment. All right with that? So as interest rates rise from 5 to 10%, the price of bonds falls by half, okay? By half, all right? And I showed you that mathematical formula, that present value, future value business that shows as interest rates rise, the current value of a bond falls, all right? Okay? To contract the economy, just the opposite, right? Federal Reserve goes out and sells bonds. What happens? Banks buy the bonds. The supply of money in the banks, okay, now decreases because they're used it up to buy bonds. And what will happen to interest rates? They will rise, okay? Interest rates rise, now consumer borrowing and spending falls, business investment falls, the value of the dollar rises, exports fall, okay? Contractionary policy, just the opposite. It's kind of hard to keep straight, but make sure you do. To expand the economy, buy bonds. Take my money, go put it in the bank. Interest rates come down. Okay? To contract the economy, sell bonds. Give me your money. Take these pieces of paper instead. Okay? Okay. Anything else? Is there anything else in here to talk about? I told you you're not going to get any questions on the equation of exchange and the crude quantity theory of money. In fact, also, if we're talking about monetary policy and action, the transmission mechanism, all right, that we just talked about, that's this bar, this graph down at the bottom, where the main effect is through interest rates, which affect business investment, which affect employment and output, GDP, okay? I don't care about targeting the federal funds rate or the Taylor rule, okay? Do you really need to know about the trading desk? I don't know. Okay. In fact, we don't care about any of the rest of this chapter at all. Okay? Yes, there's one piece that we need to know that, Gesundheit. Where's that? 354. Yeah, for monetary policy inflation, you really just need the, again, I said I don't care about the two theories, but that first paragraph you need to know. Right? Yeah, the first two. If the supply of money rises relative to the demand for money, people have more money balances than desired. They adjust their mix of assets to reduce money balances. This ultimately causes spending on goods and services to increase, and the result is a rise in the price level or inflation. Okay? So there seems to be some relationship between growth in the money supply and inflation. It depends on what you look at, right? Okay. If we're in this classical model and we get an increase in aggregate demand, some of it will be in higher output and some of that increase will be siphoned off in inflation, right? But if we're on the Keynes flat, then increases in aggregate demand will only be reflected in GDP. We won't get any inflation at all. Okay, so it depends on where we are. Once we start getting out here, right, then we get some output and some inflation. Then once we get up here, we get all inflation and no increases in output. Okay, that makes sense? So yeah, the only thing that you need to know about that is that excess growth in the money supply tends to cause inflation. And that's pretty much it. Let's do the homework, right? Everybody got your homework? Let's see. Chapter 16 homework. Let's see if I can do these. You learned in Chapter 11 that if a recessionary gap occurs in the short run, then in the long run a new equilibrium arises when input prices and expectations adjust downward, causing the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift downward and to the right, and pushing equilibrium real GDP per year back to its long-run value. Okay, so what this is talking about, of course, okay. What's going to happen if AD, oh, that was, all right. So what's going to happen here? Costs are going to fall according to the classical theory. SRAS will shift out and we'll go back to full employment, right? Okay? And the only change will be the price level. Is that what it's talking about here? If a recessionary gap, yeah, in the long run, a new equilibrium, right, when input prices and expectations fall, causing the AS curve to shift outwards and going back to full employment, real GDP. In this chapter, you learned that the Federal Reserve can eliminate a recessionary gap in the short run by undertaking a policy action that increases aggregate demand. Oh, yeah, that's right, by the way. We didn't talk, Chapter 15, about the reserve requirement, okay, which I said hasn't been used. It's at 10%, and it's been that way more or less since 1990. Okay? That if the government, if the Federal Reserve wants to restrict or reduce or contract the money supply, they can raise the reserve requirement, right? If $1 million comes in, you can lend out 900,000 of it. But if the reserve requirement goes to 20%, then you can only lend out 800,000. The money supply has contracted, and interest rates will, of course, rise. Okay? But they don't fool around with that anymore. And remember the reason, primary reason why? There's two reasons. The bond market, the open market operations are a much more effective tool. Okay? There's two reasons why they don't do this anymore. Remember the money multiplier? Okay? The money multiplier affects the effectiveness of monetary policy. What's the money multiplier going to be if we have a 10% reserve requirement? It's going to be 10, right? Remember, that's the same as MPS, okay? That portion that the bank has to save 10% so that they can lend out 90%. So if they get $1 million, then ultimately lending will go out by 10 times that amount, right? That's equal to 10. Okay with that? But if they raise that to 20%, then the money multiplier falls to 5. Monetary policy becomes less effective. The effects are less, right? If we put $1 million in, instead of getting $10 million in increased spending, now we're only going to get 5. Okay? The other thing is that it increases the risk for banks. If the banks can lend out less money, that means they have less possibility to make a profit. It makes the banks less likely to be profitable, more likely to fail. And the Federal Reserve does not want to increase risk in the financial system. They want to reduce it. So they used to use the reserve requirement because there weren't enough bonds out there to, by buying and selling them, would influence the money supplies enough. Okay? But once there are enough bonds out there, then they haven't been changing the reserve requirement. Okay. All right, so propose one monetary policy action that could eliminate the recessionary gap in the short run. Say what? Expansionary. Yeah, and what would they have to do to expand the economy? What would they have to do? Buy bonds or sell bonds? Oh. Buy bonds. Okay. What else could they do? Lower the reserve requirement also. That would be a possibility also. So those are two policy actions. Okay. By the way, I'm going to make sure this is clear, that when the Federal Reserve goes out and buys bonds and money flows into the economy, in general, interest rates are going to fall. Okay? So that's going to have a stimulating effect on the economy. And banks are going to now find that they have too much cash themselves. And in order to lend that out, not only are they going to lower interest rates for commercial purposes to consumers and business, but they're also going to lower interest rates on the bank-to-bank lending, okay? So that the federal funds rate will fall, and now banks will feel, hey, interest rates are coming down for our borrowing. If I can borrow at 1% and I can lend it out at 4%, I'm going to lend out everything I possibly can, and at the end of the day, I'll borrow what I need in the federal funds market. Okay? So that's primarily the mechanism that causes interest rates to fall, banks lending out more money because they can borrow it real cheaply. Okay? All right, 16-6, was that the next one? Explain why the net export effect of a contractionary monetary policy reinforces the usual impact that monetary policy has on equilibrium real GDP per year in the short run. What? How does the net export effect work, right? Of contractionary policy? I went over that earlier. The Federal Reserve goes out and, if they want to contract the economy, do they buy or sell bonds? Sell, okay? Take these pieces of paper, give me your cash. So everybody runs down to the bank, takes their cash out, interest rates rise. Now, consumer borrowing and spending is going to fall, business investment is going to fall. And how will that affect exports? It will also cause those to fall. How? As interest rates rise from 7 to 9% in the U.S., people want to buy dollars so they can invest in the U.S. at that higher rate. The price of the dollar rises, our goods become more expensive, exports fall. Okay? And one more, 16-12. See page 357. What are we going to see on page 357? The federal funds rate, discount rate. Yeah. I don't know. If inflation is the most significant problem in the economy,
and it wishes to employ all of its policy instruments except interest on reserves, what should the Fed do with its 3 policy tools? Okay, if inflation is a problem, then where are we? Which side of this long run curve? We're over here, right? We were here. AD shifted out. AD was here, shifted out. Now we have inflation. And what's going to happen now? Supply is going to shift in. We're going to get more inflation, right? So the Federal Reserve wants to decrease aggregate demand by contracting the money supply, okay? So what do they want to do in terms of open market operations? Sell bonds, okay? How about reserve requirement? Raise interest rates. Increase it. And what was the other tool? Oh, the federal funds. Of course, the same thing will happen, right? As money flows into the system, banks will reduce their interest rates because they have excess reserves that they don't want to have.
So increase money supply.
No, I'm sorry. They want to contract the economy, inflation, so they want to decrease money supply, right? Decrease the money supply.
What is the third one?
I'm sorry, Julio?
What is the third one?
The discount rate, I guess. Remember, the discount rate is the rate at which you can borrow from the Federal Reserve. So they want to raise that rate. Okay. The differential between the discount rate and the federal funds rate has ranged from 1/4 percentage point to 1 percentage point. Okay. What do they have to pay now, do you think? What's the federal funds rate now? Do you know? Should find that out. That should be a homework problem. I think it's about 1/4%, though. You know? Practically free money. If you can borrow at 0 interest rate, you want to lend out every possible penny you can lend out, right? And borrow as much as you can, because it's all profit, all profit. You guys okay on this?
Yes.
Yeah? All right.